I'd like to start with a few stats from Cindy Huggett, who's been a great partner and advisor to Hone. She's done a lot of research into virtual training and puts out a report every year. And in the most recent report for 2019, it showed that although 93% of organizations are using some form of live online learning, only 10% of programs are actually being administered live online. So right up until the beginning of this year, we had this disconnect. If we were doing this workshop in January, we'd have a kind of interesting conversation about why is there this disconnect of all these folks are used to doing some form of live online learning, but most of it is not live online. And then COVID changed everything. I'm just gonna admit one more person. And those changes might be forever in some sense, or permanent, at least for several years. So there's been a lot of economic disruption, obviously. There are new demands on leadership, and there's this dramatic rise in remote work. And so organizations are suddenly faced with providing training to their teams that in 90% of cases, about a year ago, you would have delivered in some other way. Now we're delivering this training live online. And probably a lot of you are encountering challenges, right? You're having to scramble and convert training that you're not used to delivering live online and potentially doing it in that modality. And as you're doing that, you're probably encountering 4 perennial high-level problems when it comes to workplace learning and training. So the first is it's not engaging enough, especially when you compare the stuff that people learn in the workplace with what they're used to learning outside of the workplace, the kinds of classes that people choose for themselves, how excited they get for stuff outside of the workplace. The engagement tends not to match up. Second, workplace learning and training tends not to be very effective in the sense that it doesn't lead to long-term memory often, specifically long-term procedural knowledge. It's not effective in another way where it tends not to lead to new habits. And lastly, even if it were engaging and effective, we're not really measuring enough to tell often. And then finally, on top of that, all of these problems can be exacerbated when you're training remote teams. So the 4 mistakes that we're referring to in the title of this session, right, don't make these 4 mistakes, they basically boil down to not taking these 4 problems seriously enough and investing special effort in making training for your teams engaging, effective, and measurable. That said, all of you have your own unique challenges. So the reason that we went into this interactive session is now we can actually talk about them. So it would help for us to kind of reflect before we move forward on what the challenges are. And to do, in order to do that, we're going to get into breakout rooms. So in a minute, I'm going to place you in a room with 2 or 3 other participants. And I'd like you all to take turns answering these questions. Let's break the seal here. Katie, what came up in your conversation?
Interesting enough, everybody was saying that making training stick after you're out of the training was probably the #1 thing.
Cool.
So yeah, that was a common thread for sure.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that in the effectiveness section. We start to deal with that problem. What else? Any other insights or patterns that you started to observe? Let's see, Rhonda, what came up in your conversation?
So definitely the challenge of follow through, because we're not there to observe any behavioral changes. So we talked about that. And the other issue was remote training taking a little bit longer than face-to-face. So looking at your content, overhauling, pulling out key learnings and priorities, and maybe reducing the amount of content, because there's no way to keep someone on a call for 8 hours.
Yep.
When a training class is 8 hours. So those were the 2 things that we talked about.
Cool. All right. So let's address all of those things. And I'm sure, really a lot of the things that come up that seem like specific to your organization are actually things that a lot of people are experiencing. So we went through the problems. We talked about your personal challenges. Now, the reason that we're here, that Hone is presenting this, is that we've been doing live virtual training since about 2017. So luckily, we've gotten to make a lot of different mistakes and struggle with engagement and effectiveness and measurement for the last 3 years. And so in the remainder of this session, I'm going to share what the most valuable lessons are that we've learned. And we found that if you do training the right way, live online, it actually can be better in a lot of ways than classroom training, in that it's more cost effective, it's more scalable, it's more inclusive, it's more flexible, it's more safe, and ultimately more effective. So here's how we can make that a reality. And some of you were asking about how to make things stick, or how to, potentially restructure some trainings and thinking about what's live and what's not. So we have this metaphor that we like to use, which is a learning cascade. So learning starts with some live experience, some live class that's supported by practice or a capstone project, maybe some triggers to actually go ahead and do the action. And then after that experience, people have access to just-in-time performance support. So things like checklists and cheat sheets and templates, really quick reference guides. And if those things don't work for somebody, then they can dive more deeply into self-paced learning and reinforcement. And if they need more, they can re-enter a live class. And it's this kind of cycle that can happen over time. I know this is, if you're worried about this kayaker, it's a very durable kayak, and learning requires you to take that plunge, so they'll be okay. I was just in Niagara Falls a couple weeks ago learning about some kid who fell in and survived. So this kayaker will be okay. Why do you think why do you think it might be a good idea to start with a live class rather than just jumping into performance support or self-paced learning?
Establish the connection.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that happens is you get an emotional connection to the content, to the potentially the goals of the training, getting people emotionally invested in that. What else might be a reason why we start with a live experience?
To build on the previous comment, to establish context.
Yeah, to establish, and that context can be pretty broad. So it's context for the actual training itself. It's also context around where can you get, where is the performance support, and where can I access the self-paced learning and reinforcement and so forth. So absolutely, those are all good reasons. You can also think about it in other terms. What if you started with the just-in-time performance support or the self-paced learning and reinforcement? And the problem with that, it seems great. It's pretty, it's pretty cost effective. You just put out a bunch of videos for people. The problem with that is that most people are poor judges of what learning methods work. And so a lot of people will kind of half listen to a video or half read through something and think that's enough. The problem is you can't ask questions of a video. The video doesn't really check for understanding, and there's only so much that you can get from giving someone a multiple choice question. And so all of these things can be resolved if you have a seasoned, cameras on, a virtual experience with a seasoned facilitator who's cued into when people are paying attention, what they understand or don't understand. And again, as all of you mentioned, what you get is this extra context, this extra motivation, giving people crucial bits of feedback, making them feel safe to make mistakes. All of that stuff can happen in that live experience. Leading up to the rest of the resources. There's a quote by Alexander Pope. There's a poem that begins with these two lines: "Little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring." This idea that if you learn a little bit, it's actually kind of more dangerous than not knowing anything. So you think you know a lot. You have this illusion of learning. Oh yeah, I know how to give feedback now, or I know how to hire people. I watch this video or whatever it is, right? So how do we make sure that people are not drinking shallow, they're drinking deep? And so for the rest of this session, I'd like to focus in on really concrete tips for what to do in this live experience to set up everything else so that people are engaged, learning is actually sticking, and we're seeing action at the other end of it. Awesome. So Lisa asked, how does performance support differ from self-paced reinforcement? So the performance support is just like a really quick reference guide. Might be like a checklist that I can, what are the steps of giving feedback again? Oh yeah, I'm just gonna quickly reference this. Self-paced learning and reinforcement might be watching a few videos, taking a quiz, maybe reading some articles, going a little bit more deeply than that. So before I reveal our kind of most important tips for engagement, let's take a second to answer in the chat. What are some things that you have seen that would increase engagement with live virtual training? Take about a minute. Lisa mentions activities, absolutely. Another one for activities, lots of interaction, constant interaction, seeing live faces. These are all great. We're going to talk about all of these: breakout rooms, role plays, discussions. Yeah, awesome. All of these are right on. Yeah, changing modalities up. Yeah, you all are experts. You're in the right place. So these are the things that we've observed are the most important. And I'm breaking these out in terms of or across what you can do in the learning experience, what you can do as a facilitator, what you can do in the technology, and then what you can do as an L&D or HR leader, even if you're not actually designing any of the training. So first most important part, which we've already kind of alluded to, what do you do if you have 8 hours of training? Well, unfortunately, you have to keep sessions short, which largely means 60 minutes or less. When I first started at Hone, I was like, working on these workshops, let's do 75-minute, 90-minute workshops. And you start to see that there are a lot of diminishing returns after that 60-minute mark. So when you start to get into multiple hours, then you're really getting diminishing returns. And you're better off just breaking sessions up over time. And that's probably better anyway, because if you break sessions up over time, it gives you more time for knowledge to start to stick, more time for reflection, more time for practice. Within that hour session, as somebody just mentioned, keep it constant, have constant interaction. Every 3 to 5 minutes, there should be something. A question that you ask the audience, a poll, a breakout room, some form of collaboration. Introduce it early, and people start to get comfortable with it. Whenever possible, ask questions before presenting material. And when you're presenting material, do so in short bite-sized steps. So I'll tell you that in this session, there's a lot of content. There's more content than you would see in a typical workshop that we would provide, because usually we're breaking sessions down into 3 to 4 session sprints. So if we had a whole sprint on designing effective learning experiences for remote teams, we might have one session that's focused entirely on building engaging experiences. The second session might be focused entirely on effectiveness and making learning stick. The third session might be focused entirely on measurement, and so forth. And so we found that creating these sprints where people have one central idea that they're working on, and it's broken up into 60-minute sessions every week, that format has worked really well, keeps people engaged, and creates a spacing effect where that increases learning and makes things stick rather than forcing everything in one day. When it comes to facilitation, there are lots of small things that we found make an enormous difference. So one thing that you notice I've been doing is calling people by their names, right? Nobody wants to participate. As soon as you call someone by their name, they perk up, it's engaging. And it's easier to do this in a smaller session, right? Having a cameras on expectation, also part of that social engagement, make sure that people are paying attention. Setting the ground rules for interaction up front, making sure that people aren't multitasking. So for example, these are the house agreements that we have at the beginning of every Hone session. We have these house agreements. Everybody knows they have to keep their videos on. There's no multitasking, right? You're gonna get called on probably. And if you make a mistake, hey, no problem. This is a judgment-free space, and getting people to really feel that. When you set the ground rules, you wanna make sure that everybody's participating. So usually we'd have a session that's 10 to 15 people, so it's easier for the facilitator to keep track of who spoke in, who hasn't. And then if you have breakout rooms and things like that, you can also make sure that everyone has a chance to practice. And then you can potentially pop into breakout rooms as well. So if you use Zoom, that's an option that you have. So I could have, if I wanted to, pop into your breakout rooms, not to police attention, but it's important that everyone's paying attention, because when you go into those breakout rooms, if not everyone is up to date, you're kind of penalizing your partners, right? Because they're not going to have as rich of a conversation. Speaking of technology and breakout rooms and all of that stuff, it's really important to get to know all of the features that you have in your delivery tool. So we use Zoom, and it has lots of rich interaction that we can play with. If you see here on the left, this is also a chart from Cindy Huggett, who did all that great research on live virtual. These are the most popular tools that are being used right now. If you're using one of these and you're not necessarily locked into one or another, you can maybe try out one of these other ones in this list. Again, this is in your learner guide, so if you want to reference this later to try this out. And then secondly, related to that is whatever tool that you're going to use, ensure everyone has a webcam and high-speed internet. Because if you start to get people lagging, it can ruin the experience for everybody, especially if there's a lot of interaction built in. Finally, our last section on engagement, and then we're going to have a discussion about this. There are many things that you can do, even if you're not designing or delivering the training yourself, that could make a huge difference. One that we've seen is so our customers that are really active in getting buy-in prior to the program have been really successful. So this might involve sending out an email or a form where you're saying, here's the expectations of the program. There's going to be homework involved. There's going to be a capstone project, and getting people to sign off and check it off, say, yes, I'm committed to doing that. Likewise, we found it a lot easier that people get buy-in when you're focused on what you're actually aiming for, what the behavioral changes are, what the cultural changes in your organization are, rather than the program itself. We're doing this management program so that we get to whatever it is. It'd be awesome if you can show up to some of the trainings as well and encourage other leaders to occasionally drop in, maybe at the beginning, to show that people really care about this. And then finally, I had mentioned this a few times, but if you can focus on breaking up groups into about 10 to 15 folks, then the in-class collaboration is a lot more manageable. The breakout rooms are manageable. The capstone projects and all of that stuff work better. And you also get an opportunity to potentially update the program over time. We have one wave of managers going through it this week. And then the next week, we have another wave, but maybe in between each wave, you can make program adjustments rather than kind of giving everything to everybody at once. So let's discuss this. We have all of these different tips, right? It's very, very large number, and these are probably the most important ones, but there are other ones, right? Of these, what stands out to you, and which one of these do you feel like you're going to invest in more? Let's answer in the chat. Might be something that you're already doing that you realize actually we should be doing that even more, or something that you haven't been doing at all. Laura mentioned short sessions. Kimberly mentioned checking for a point of interaction, calling people by name. 3 to 4 session sprints, a lot of people are mentioning. Laura, what stood out to you about the 3 to 4 session sprints?
I think you give people a break to really understand the content, to meet again. So it's a continuation of learning, but not too long, so people will lose the interest, I guess.
Yeah. We found that at first we were being really ambitious. We're like, let's create these 12 session boot camps that people are going to do over 6 months. And it was crazy. People would drop off after the 5th session. So it was doing 3 to 4 session things with a capstone project at the end has been kind of the sweet spot. Yeah. Leah mentions getting buy-in prior to the program. How might you do that in your practice?
I like the idea of just getting commitment, and I like that with the ground rules as well, just to make sure that they're both set up ahead of time so that entering people are prepared, and that they've connected with it.
Yep.
So how is remotely?
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you everybody for reflecting on this. Again, this is all in your learner guides, and you'll also get a recording of this session afterward if you want to reference any of these. Let's talk about effectiveness, which is a sticking point, right? No pun intended, for a lot of folks when it comes to virtual training. So the first thing when it comes to effectiveness that we understand is kind of foundational. It's just when we think about behaviors rather than topics, it kind of opens up everything else to be more active and interactive. So behavior it's not a one-off task or action. It's the way somebody acts in response to a stimulus. So great behaviors of management are giving feedback, having coaching conversations, having one-on-ones with your direct reports, running interviews, doing performance reviews. All of these things are behaviors of management or leadership. And it doesn't matter if you're focused on management, it could be behaviors of a salesperson, behaviors of a product designer, and what have you. And then within those behaviors, it's important to focus on procedural rather than declarative knowledge. Can anyone tell me the difference between procedural and declarative knowledge or memory? Anyone want to take a guess? So
it's basically the difference between knowing something intellectually versus being able to do it practically.
Absolutely. That's right. Thank you, Lisa. So declarative knowledge refers to facts that you know, right? Stuff that you can talk about. Procedural knowledge refers to acts. It's things that you know how to do. So for example, when it comes to bikes, right? Something that declarative memory or declarative knowledge might be knowing what the difference is between a mountain bike and a road bike, right? And being able to answer this question. And the thing on the left, that's what a lot of our training looks like. We have these multiple choice questions that, just pertain to facts. On the right is procedural memory. It's actually knowing how to ride the bike, which is probably more useful ultimately. So declarative memories are easy to form. They're also easily forgotten, as you probably experienced from your history class days. You don't remember too many of the specific facts. But procedural memories are more durable, right? We all remember probably how to ride a bike, even if you haven't done it in a while. These memories are wired into our brains and our bodies. And when we're trying to get people to memorize a series of management best practices or memorize how to give feedback, we're ignoring that there's a physical component to all of these things, right? Who would want to receive feedback from a manager who knows to be clear and direct, but can't relay that criticism with compassion? Or a salesperson who knows all the benefits of a product, but can't make you feel as if they have your best interest in mind, right? All of these interactions feel a certain way, and if you don't do them in a certain way, they're not effective, even if you know all of the background facts. So we need to focus on actions if we're trying to get stuff to stick. And there are three really important elements that help us wire actions into people. First, it's having learners at the end of a session make a commitment, and we'll see what that looks like. So it's another form of creating these expectations, but at the end of the session, so there's something concrete and actionable they're doing. Then, as we've seen, splitting learners into breakout groups or what we call accountability groups, especially if you have a sprint and you have 4 folks going through the same 3 or 4 session sprint, they're going to be together, giving each other feedback, doing projects together, practicing together. Although we found that splitting it up 50-50, where you're not always with your accountability group, sometimes with you're with other people is also a good way to introduce folks to others. And then finally, at the end of a sprint, we have a capstone project that has real world application. So let's take a look at this in action. And if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Aiden asks, recommendations on how to maintain accountability within an organization on attendance, adherence to ground rules. Yes, we'll get into that in the 3rd section when we talk about measurement and accountability. So here's an example. This is not what we're doing right now. This is an example from the How to Ask Powerful Questions workshop. So asking powerful questions, that's the behavior that we're targeting. And the first breakout room in that session, after the participants learn about Arthur Aaron's 36 questions that lead to love, they get to try them out in their breakout group. So we just had a similar kind of breakout room where you talked about your challenges when it came to training remote teams. just kind of sets the context, gets you thinking about it and reflecting about the topic at hand, and gets you interacting with other people, getting to know other people and some of the folks in your breakout group. Then later on in the session, there's guided practice. So this is guided case study. We have an argument between the sales team and the product team, and we're learning about the kinds of questions we might ask to resolve the conflict. So we do that together in a guided practice. Then when folks learn about different question types, and we talk about them, then they get to actually apply that by interviewing the facilitator and saying so they get the information about the facilitator on the left, and then before they ask a question, they have to say what kind of question is it. So, hey, Sheba, you know, what's your favorite coaching topic? That's an example of an open question, right? So they're practicing it again in a kind of guided, scaffolded way. And then finally, there's a breakout room at the end where now that they've learned all these question techniques and they've looked at how questions work in the GROW coaching model, they then ask questions from the GROW model and follow-up questions in their breakout rooms. So it kind of comes full circle. You get this interactive experience all the way through. Some of it is with your breakout room, some of it is guided and scaffolded with the facilitator, but there's always this interaction and wiring and procedural knowledge that we're practicing. And then finally, as I mentioned, there's a commitment at the end. So this, we actually link to a survey where they can fill out what is your commitment for the week, and then they get that information sent back to them, saying like, hey, this is what you committed to. We've also seen folks opt into that commitment going to the manager of that person, saying, hey, your direct report has committed to this week. Try to give them some feedback on it if you can, just making the manager aware. And then finally, at the end of, there's a sprint if folks are working on questions and one-on-ones and coaching. So you take those three things, there's a capstone challenge that's related to that. So they actually have to use certain kinds of questions in their one-on-one. So this is an example of, with one of our clients, the specific capstone that was given. So there are three things that everybody has to do, and then they can choose what kinds of conversations they have. Nice. Lisa mentions, big fan of the I do, we do, you do activity sequence. Absolutely, it really is that kind of thing where, you know, you're modeling it for folks, then you're doing it together, and then you're letting them do it on their own with some performance support, right? Everybody's got the learner guide that they can reference if they need help. And the way that, and so we're all going to practice this together in a second. If you haven't noticed, we're kind of modeling all these things at the same time, right? So the way to bake in those effectiveness boosters in the learning experience is to lean on your facilitators. So for example, if you have a sprint, you can start a class with a review of the previous material. So session 2, you start the class with a review of session 1. You might ask people about commitments, right? Hey, how's this going? You committed to this, or how's your commitment going? That's actually the default question we ask in every subsequent session after the first one. The fourth session in a sprint is the capstone session, where people just share their capstones and talk about how it went and show off their projects depending on what they're learning. And then it might make sense to invest in some virtual facilitator training, because there are some folks that are really great in one context. They might be a really good manager, or a really good virtual manager, or a really good presenter in person, but they're not quite a great virtual facilitator because maybe they don't know the tool, or they don't have as much experience. So investing in some training might be a good idea there as well. And then lastly, before we actually go ahead and try this out on our own, some things that you can do to boost effectiveness as an L&D or a people leader are clarifying what are the exact expectations here. Now that we've gone through the training, what are the KPIs? For example, if you're trying to get people to do one-on-ones in your organization, the KPI might be, we want 80% of our people to have reported that they're doing consistent one-on-ones every week by a certain date, right? That's a KPI that sets the expectation for everybody to focus on and direct their action toward. We also want to tie training to moments of need, which we'll look at in 1 second. Throughout, just like you're getting people to commit beforehand, afterward, you're asking them questions. Hey, how's this going? You're encouraging application. And you're providing feedback, or you're encouraging your managers to provide feedback to whoever is learning, both critical and positive feedback. So the moment of need is a really nifty thing to talk about because it kind of solves the problem of motivation. So as you approach a moment of need, which is any moment that is getting people to feel like there's something urgent going on that they want to prepare for. So if I have an interview coming up, or I have a performance review coming up, or I have to give my first presentation to the board and I've never done that, that's an example of a moment of need. And prior to that moment of need, people are super open to learning. They want to get ready for it. They want to brush up on it. At the moment of need, there's not that much time to learn. So they're kind of just focused on performance support. But then afterward, they might reflect, after I do my presentation or my interview, I'm open to thinking, well, how did that go? Could I have done that better, right? What problems can I fix? If you wait enough days after, you kind of don't care about it anymore, right? So there's this window of motivation that we want to focus on. And that motivation is really powerful to get people to do things. So we want to track those moments of need across the organization and align our training to those moments, or potentially get people to, after you do the training, we're preparing for this moment of need. This is when the action is going to take place. So those moments might be in your HRIS system. There are kind of things that are like when someone joins the organization, right? Onboarding, a lot of you mentioned. That's an HRIS moment. As soon as that person joins the organization, what are the actions that need to be done? There might be recurring calendar moments, like annual performance reviews or quarterly planning that happen at the same time every year. There might be other kinds of recurring moments that happen randomly across time. There's an interview or a project kickoff. There might be organizational changes like a project launch or a product launch or a global expansion. So these are all high motivation moments where you can get people to care about learning and to start changing their behavior. And if there isn't a pressing moment of need, you can always create one from scratch. You can assign somebody a new project. You can give somebody a new person a responsibility. You can declare a new company initiative to get people motivated. So if we're focused on powerful questions, on asking questions, that's the skill or behavior that we're focused on. What would be a point of need for applying that new skill? What would be an example of that?
Could giving feedback be an example? Like giving training on how to give feedback, and then later on a manager's like, I have to deliver this tough feedback to my direct report. How I need to brush up on this. Can you help me?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah. But so that's for the skill of giving feedback or the behavior of giving feedback. What about for the behavior of asking questions? What would be an example of a moment of need you can create or call upon? Let's get Marielle, are you here?
I'm here.
Yeah, what do you think a moment of need might be for the applying new question skills?
When someone is in need of learning a new process.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, if they need to ask certain questions about that process to learn about it. Yeah. Another example might be if you have an interview coming up, or if you have a performance review coming up. These are events where you're going to ask a lot of questions. Perfect. Now we're going to do the powerful questions training right before that, right? Or if you want people to care more about it, you assign them something that has to do with it, right? So let's look back at the learning cascade, because we're going to practice this together right now in breakout rooms. So we have this live class. It's supported by all of this sticky stuff, practice and capstone and triggers that leads to some performance support, that leads to some self-paced learning and reinforcement. And then if somebody needs more, they'll re-enter a live class. So I'm going to put you back into breakout rooms. And your challenge, we're going to spend maybe 7 minutes on this. Probably not going to get through all of this, but challenge yourself as a learning professional. Hopefully this exercise was fruitful, as was said, for you, even if your training it doesn't exactly match this kind of sprint framework. Now, regardless of the kind of training that you're doing, you're going to need to do some measurement. And the measurement model that we like the most is the learning transfer evaluation model. I'm very proud that it was developed by a friend of mine, Dr. Will Thalheimer, a couple of years ago. You may be familiar with the Kirkpatrick 4-model measurement model, which actually, as it turns out, through some digging by Will Thalheimer, was stolen from this dude, Raymond Katzel, in the 50s, I think. And there's this whole kind of hubbub about it and where it actually originated, because the Kirkpatrick children are involved in that. But no drama here. So we're going to focus on the learning transfer evaluation model, which is more in depth and has more tiers. And so Aiden had mentioned, I think a few of others had mentioned, how are you tracking accountability at different steps? And so depending on the tier, you're tracking it in different ways. So for example, at Hone, we track attendance in an automated way. We just see, and this will probably be true for all of you as well, depending on the tool you're using, to track what kind of activity, how much people are talking and so forth. There are certain session analytics that we've built where we can identify that. Learner perceptions, we're looking at through the feedback that we're getting. And I'll give you some examples of that. Those are all included in your learner guide, a bunch of different questions that you can ask. And then to evaluate knowledge and decision-making competence and task competence, that's in all of the practice, capstone projects, all that kind of stuff, which also has to do with transfer. And then when you're looking at the effects of transfer, did this actually work in our organization? We're looking at 180 assessments that we do before and after all of the trainings. So I can't go through these right now. I'll just say, and I only put these in here just for you to use. These are great questions that get at different things. So if you're focused on enjoyment, you can ask this question. There's a question on accessibility. Again, this is all in your learner guide. How to ask about effectiveness, how to ask about the effectiveness of your facilitator. This is a really interesting question that I encourage you folks to consider. And then there are some additional questions as well. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us. Before you leave, I wanted to let you know just a little bit more about Hone, especially the programs that we have on offer right now. So if you're interested in converting your existing training into live online, that's something I'd be happy to help you out with. You just email me for free. I'll show you my email address in 1 second. But if these are your training needs in your organization and you'd like to consider a kind of sprint model that we've talked about, these are the ones that we have on offer. And then again, please email me if you have any specific questions. If anything that I mentioned was kind of relevant to your specific case, but there are some unique aspects, definitely email me. And also if you'd like any help with your management or leadership training. Again, please go to tiny.cc/hone feedback right now to fill out a quick evaluation form. I'd really appreciate it. And then it could also help crystallize some of your thinking about the session. I'm gonna stick around for another few minutes if anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask right now, but otherwise, thanks so much for joining, everyone. Good luck with all of your projects, and yeah, thank you.